This project is for any double knitting board. That's a loom that has two sets of pegs that are parallel to one another. I will be demonstrating the shawl using 50 pegs on the Noble Knitter, with the boards spaced quite widely apart, and using 2 strands of yarn held together as one, so it's warm, it's bulky, and the knitting goes fast. However, you may get something much smaller and lighter and more scarf-like simply by spacing the boards closer together and using a single strand of worsted weight yarn, otherwise known as number 4 yarn. I will also make suggestions throughout the series as to where you could remove some stitches, use fewer stitches, and get a different size of project. And 2 or more panels side by side can create a blanket. If you follow the way I am knitting it exactly, you will get a shawl about 22 inches wide. I'm using a Noble Knitter, quite widely spaced between the boards with 1.5 inches gap between them. This board didn't actually come with enough washers or long enough bolts to do this. I bought extra long bolts at the hardware store and added nuts and washers until the spacing was what I wanted. But I want to be perfectly clear. This project does not require a particular loom. Any double knitting board will do. I've made similar things with my very old authentic knitting board, with my KB all-in-one loom, with a homemade loom, and with my Kiss looms set up without the pin boards, just using the peg boards. So it's quite a versatile technique, and that's more a technique than it is specific to one loom or another. Just adjust your loom to get a fabric you like. Since a shawl is a very flexible project regarding fit, the fabric you like is far more important than a particular gauge. But holding 2 strands of number 4 yarn together with my loom adjusted as shown, I got a little bit over 2 stitches per inch. So using 50 stitches, the shawl is 22 inches wide. My row gauge is not quite 3 rows per inch. Row gauge is not critical for this project because you can simply keep on knitting until the shawl is the length you want, or the scarf, or the blanket. But this is the gauge I'm working with. In this movie, we will cast on and knit the first 5 rows. You can cast on either by knotting a loop in the yarn, as I just showed you, and hanging that loop on a peg, or by making a true slip knot, as I'm doing now. 2 wraps around a couple of fingers, over, pull through, and then it will slide and adjust. And there's the loop that you hang on a peg to begin with. Cast on goes like this. Place the loop on the end peg on the back board, wrap around the end peg on the front board. Now the second peg on the back board, and then begin zigzagging to and fro using every other peg on each board. I've been trying to keep my hand out of your way, but now I'm doing it the way I really do it, with my right hand wrapping, in this case, and my left hand following along, grabbing every loop and pinching it onto the peg as I get there. That prevents that slippage that is so annoying to knitters. When you've wrapped a peg, you think everything's fine. Your wrap slips off when you're a little ways away. Just keep on wrapping, pinching with your fingertips. After you've passed and you're onto a few more pegs, there's not so much of a tendency to uncoil. It's right when you're doing it that the slippage will occur. Resist the temptation, frequent to newbies, to wrap overly tightly. It's not good for the yarn or the loom, and it makes the gauge uneven. Use the pinching method instead, and I think you'll be much happier. Now, when you get to the far end, wrap the last peg on whatever side you end up on, and then go wrap the peg on the other board. So there's my last on the back, wrapping the last on the front, and beginning to make the trip back. The trip back is very, very easy. we simply pick up every peg that was left empty, zigzagging to and fro between the backboard and the front board. Every peg should end up with at least one wrap on it. In this case, that wrap will consist of 2 strands of yarn because I'm treating the 2 yarns as though they were one. At the left-hand edge, I like to wrap back to the front so that I can anchor the final stitch. My way is almost the exact normal classic stockinette cast on. I don't know that that extra wrap is, but I like it for security and it doesn't seem to cause any problems. Now, we're cast on, but to make the next few rows easier to knit, we'll get a contrasting strand of yarn, thread it all the way across all of our zigzags, push it down below the loom on each side of the stitches inside of the spacers and knot the bottom together. This is often called an anchor cord. It will give us some control over the first couple rows, which are the hardest of any double knitting project, because we can tug it down, and tugging on it like that helps to keep the first row of stitches knitting off and also the beginning wraps, which we will later be using, organized. The next 5 rows of this project are exactly like each other. They're all plain stockinette. Begin by wrapping the end peg on the backboard and the next to the end peg on the front board, and then zig and zag to and fro across the board. When you get to the far end, wrap across the end. Just as when casting on, it's almost exactly like casting on. The only difference is that, well, I doubled up a wrap at the end of my cast on. I'm not going to do it for any stitching rows. There I come around the end and back. If you ever get called away or you need help creating neat ends, here's a trick. It's okay to knit over a couple of stitches, 1 or more, before you have finished the wrap. It will mean that if you have to put your knitting down to handle an emergency and you've partially wrapped a row, all is not lost. It won't uncoil the minute you have your back turned. And anytime you feel that you just need a little bit more security, stop and knit over a stitch or 2. The only problem with that is not really a problem. Don't be fooled when you go to knitting the whole side and there's not a wrap on a peg. Just remind yourself to take a look. Did I already knit this one over for safekeeping? On this first row, after knitting a few stitches, often about 10, it begins to feel loose and floppy and hard to control the knitting over, and that's when tugging on your anchor cord can bring the stitches back down to a manageable position. Another thing you can do if you have a wide gap, as I do, often you don't and you can't reach up between, but since I do, I can flip the loom over and use my tool to pull the slack down between the boards, and that's quite a help. Many people prefer to turn the loom so that the backboard is now facing them, and that's fine, but you can also just tilt it and knit over with the board still away from you, as I'm doing here. And you can see that the stitches are getting a little loose and hard to manage. I find that on this first row on the backboard, you tend to get more confusion about what is really one wrap versus another. And since I'm using 2 strands of yarn, just a heads up, make sure you get them sorted out so you know which pair actually constitutes one wrap. It'll knit if you don't, but it will make a very sloppy beginning to the work. So you want to know which wrap was the beginning. And because of the tendency for the wraps all to rise up on the pegs, you have to take a little bit extra care to make certain that you do keep them organized and each stitch knitted over in its unique self. And again, flipping over the loom and pulling out the slack can be helpful. After that very first row, everything gets much, much easier. Use the same wrap every single row and knit the bottom set of loops over the top set of loops until there are 5 stockinette rows. And we want a pretty finished edge like this. We're up to this point of the knitting now. And then we'll go on with the cable pattern. Here's how we're going to get that nice neat edge. Finishing the bind off begins on the opposite end from where the yarn tail from the cast on is sitting. We want to chain together the cast on wraps, but there were in fact 100 wraps and we only want 50 chain stitches. It can help to organize those wraps because of everything else that has happened to them so far, they tend to have stacked up on each other and sometimes twisted. So start with the one on the very end, then skip a pair of strands, which is 1 loop, grab the second one, pull it through, making a chain stitch, skip one, grab one, pull the pair through, skip one, grab one, make sure that it is truly a pair, pull it through, skip a wrap, grab a wrap, only of course each wrap is 2 strands with the design that I'm working with. If you're using doubled yarn as I am, you'll have 2. You see how they can get somewhat disorderly and confused, and it's important that we organize them and make certain which ones we're getting. So if that edge of wraps gets messy, here's how to be sure. Your pair that makes 1 single loop should come out of the same place in a stitch. Here I've definitely isolated the next pair, so now I can grab it with the crochet hook and pull it through the existing loop. It's just a simple chain stitch, chaining every other loop. It's just that we have to do some tidying up and organizing prior to pulling each loop through to make certain that we have the right one. Due to the design of the cast on, the sets of loops can tend to come in pairs, first, second. Also, due to the nature of the cast on, none of them will unravel. The point is to get a neat edge. So make sure that you do separate first pair and second pair. And if you are using the second pair, as I am, that is always the one that you grab with the crochet hook and pull through. So although chain stitch is basically easy, this is not as quick as usual. However, the reward is a nice, neat edge forming. When you get up to the very end, pull the final loop through the one that's already on the tool, and then pull the yarn tail through. The yarn tail may easily be pulled in between the layers of the double-sided fabric and just made to disappear. We'll snip off the excess by tugging and snipping. Now the anchor cord has served its purpose. We can snip it or break it and pull it out. The edge may not look instantly beautiful, but it should pull into shape with just a little bit of tweaking. At this point, you have completed the project up to the point marked by the arrow. In the next video, we will go on to the cable pattern and the textural stripes that accompany it. There's no need to be nervous, even though it looks very detailed. It's actually incredibly easy. Also, you should know there will be a written pattern with lots of options built into it, and it is going to be a paid pattern sold on Ravelry. However, the next video will contain a coupon code, so those who watch the video all the way through can get it for free.